Hi, I'm Ivan Weiss. I'm a portrait photographer based in King's Cross in London. I shoot headshots for everyone from actors and entertainers to executives and entrepreneurs. I've been a user of Affinity Photo for a long time now, and it's really an essential part of my post-production workflow. The people at Affinity have asked me to put together a short video as part of their Lockdown 2020 creative sessions. So I thought what I would do is walk you through a typical workflow for color grading a dramatic portrait. So the portrait we're going to use for this this demonstration, I shot this about 10 days ago while in lockdown, so it's a self-portrait. I can't have anyone in the studio, unfortunately. For those of you who want the technical details, it's shot on a 50mm lens, I think f5.6, and the light is a 70cm beauty dish with a grid as the key light and a ring light on the camera as the fill. This is quite typical of my work in terms of the color palette and the contrast and shadow. I'm just going to zoom out there so we can see the full thing. Now, of course, when we're going into color grading and post-production in general, we can enhance what's there, but we need to capture the essence of it in camera. So I'm going to show you the starting point. This is what I got in camera. And you can see already, because of the lighting, I've got quite strong shadows, quite a lot of contrast. And because of the way I set the shot up, I've also got a very reduced palette. So the background is grey, the wardrobe is green, and then the skin tones and the desk that I'm leaning on similarly sort of reds and yellows, oranges, I suppose. So there's not a lot of other colours going on there. And that's something that I like to do. I like to really reduce the color palette so then you can play with contrast and color contrast to really make something quite bold without it being overpowering and busy. It makes it feel more sort of harmonious, even though we're going to go quite extreme with the color and the contrast. Before we get to the color grading, I'll just give you a quick word on the retouching that I've done on this. So on the background layer already, I went in and took care of the little things, stray hairs, bits of dust, that kind of stuff. That's already been dealt with the in-painting tool. I then set up frequency separation layers using the frequency separation filter. I did that at a 2-pixel radius, so quite a small radius. And then in between those two layers, I've done a little bit of work, and I will show you by zooming in, a little bit of work on the face. I don't like to over retouch skin. I want it to feel realistic. So that means there's going to be some variation in there, some small blemishes, but if things are distracting, then I like to minimize them or remove them completely. And in this case, I know that we're going to really bump up the contrast later on. So I want to be careful of where my highlights are. And looking here on the nose, there's quite a strong highlight that is lighter than the highlight on the forehead. So using the healing brush, I've just taken that down a little bit so that it's in line with the highlight that's on the forehead. And then again, because we're going to bump up the contrast, the small variations in skin color, skin tone are going to get amplified. So I just want to control those a little bit. And I've used a selective color adjustment to just damp down the reds a little bit and painted that in some key areas. So as I switch that off and back on again, you'll see that there's some redness in the side of the nose, on the tip of the nose, and in the under eye areas that I've just dealt with selective color. And then finally, I've used some dodging and burning to add more contour to the face. And this is just enhancing what's already there, selectively amplifying some of the shadows and just bringing up some of the highlights a little bit. So if I switch those on there, you can see what's going on. So let's get into the color grade. The basis of my workflow is for this type of portrait is always the same. I start with a lookup table, a LUT that I created several years ago, that basically shifts all my colors to where I like them. I like green, I like gold. I'm not a big fan of blue. So essentially what this LUT does is it crushes the blues almost completely, and it just shifts everything else a bit towards green. So I'm going to open it up here, and you'll see that the name of the LUT that I created is Winter Greens, and that's just a little nod to one of my favorite photographers, Dan Winters, who also, in my opinion, makes great use of greens in his work. So we've applied that LUT. You can see, let's just look at the histogram there. If I switch it off, the histogram when we started was everything in the middle. Plenty of space at the top, bit of space at the bottom, and a fair amount of variation in the midtones there, the lower midtones. As I apply that LUT, the blues get really squashed down, the reds and greens get squashed down a bit, and the overall exposure is taken down. But it has increased the relative contrast. And what we're going to do now is just work to pull that back out, and you'll see that it gives quite a different look because of the way that we've dealt with those colors. So I'm just going to add a curves layer, and we're going to go in somewhere quite near the top and bring those highlights back up. Somewhere around there looks good. So we're bringing those highlights back up to where they were. Because we've done this with a curve, of course, that's also brought up the shadows and the midtones, and that's not what we want. So we're now going to go in and just push those midtones back down and the shadows back down. So there we get something really quite dramatic there. We've boosted that contrast. The background has gone to a grey green, and it's all starting to feel like it's coming together already. But we're not going to stop there. Let me just save that. What we're going to do next is, again, a standard part of my workflow. I'm going to add some color overlays, and the overlays that I use, I will show you, as well as being color overlays are also texture overlays. Let me just get that centered on there nicely. So this is a photograph that I took of a piece of wood that I found in a skip that is now doubling as the tabletop that I'm leaning on. And it's very badly whitewashed, so it's got lots of brush strokes in it, lots of uneven texture. The brush strokes are not even going in the same direction, so it's quite sort of messy. And I took a close-up photograph of that, and then in Affinity Photo I added a bit of a vignette, and then played with the tones separately in the different levels of exposure. So the darker areas have got this richer kind of reddish orange to them, and the lighter areas like here and here are much more towards yellow. And the reason I like to use these kind of things, I seem to have added two of them there. I'm just going to delete one of them. The reason I like to use these is that it adds a sense of depth and texture to the image while also adding color. And doing the two things together just seems to work for me. So I've got that file there. Now I need to apply it as an overlay. Before I do that, I'm going to switch it off and just mention something about how I compose my images. If we look at this just purely in terms of luminance, The light areas of the image are all skin, and the dark areas are the background and the desk and the clothes. Now, because I'm going to be adding some texture, I don't really want to add an unnatural texture to skin. That's not going to give me a good look. So one way that I can deal with that in most of my work is to simply use the blend options. If I don't blend into the highlights, I'm not going to be blending into the skin. And there's on one of the Affinity forums, I found somebody who had quite kindly uploaded a set of macros for doing this automatically. Darks 3 is one that I like. Let's just do that, and you can see it automatically creates this curve. If I switch the layer on, you can see now that it's not affecting the highlights, and then it's getting progressively more effect as the image gets darker. So that's good. I'm going to then change the blend mode to overlay, and you can see without it and with it. So it's added this richness, this kind of golden tone to it, predominantly in the shadows and a little bit in the mids, and then none in the highlights. We're going to do the same thing again, this time with a different overlay. And this one is, let's just place this on here correctly. There we go. This is again a shot of the same table, but I've done a different color treatment on it. This time going for these kind of grayish green, so I guess you could call it olive or khaki, something like that. And again, different tones in the shadows and different tones in the highlights. And we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to apply it to the darks only, there. So it's revealing the skin, see the hand and the face, but it's going to add the texture elsewhere to the image. And I'm going to change that blend mode to overlay. So let's just take a look at the before and after. And that's starting to look really nice and rich. That's essentially my starting point for most of the images that I do that are in this style. But then for each image, there's a lot of individual and subtle tweaks that need to be made in order to really get the image to pop. So that's going to vary. What you do to it depends on, you know, what wardrobe the person's wearing, what their skin tone is like, how you've lit it, what color the background is. All of those kind of things are going to have an influence here on those decisions. There's any number of ways to make subtle adjustments to color in Affinity Photo. We're going to use a few of them here. I don't think there's any one that's better than another. It just depends on what's most appropriate for the image. So I'll show you a few different techniques here, and we'll combine them to start making the subtle adjustments to get this image to where I want it to be. And one of my favorite ones to use is to use a curves layer and to put it into lab. Now I'm just going to duplicate that twice, and I'm going to call the top one L, I'm going to call the middle one A, and I'm going to call the first one B. And what we're going to do there is go in and manipulate the curves separately for those three components, or opponents as they are in lab color space. You can do it all in one adjustment layer. That's perfectly fine. I like to separate them out so that I can then, if necessary, play with the individual opacities to balance them against each other more precisely. So let's open up this, and we're going to take it to the B opponent. And what's great about this way of manipulating color is because it's a curve, it applies things gradually. So it's always a fairly smooth effect. And I'll just show you. If I put an anchor point in the center, if I grab a point up here and start to move that up gradually, you can see that it's going to start pushing the lower bit of the curve down. Yeah. So by using anchor points, we can make sure that we're staying balanced and not getting too extreme with our adjustments. So I'm just going to pull this one over something like that and just pop that one up a little more. And then let's come back to the midpoint, and I'm just going to bump that a few clicks up this way, and you can see the effect that it's having there. It's starting to shift the midtones to this more golden yellow. That's way too much for what I want. And if we were to go the other way, it starts to sort of add this blue, it feels more matte, a bit more washed out. So I don't need to make a very big adjustment here at all. That actually looks good where it is. So we're going to go with that. Let's just save. Then for the A opponent, let's open that up and set that to here. You don't have to do it this way, but as I went with an inverse S-curve on the previous layer, I'm going to go with an S-curve on this one. So it's a way of building more contrast into my color and giving me more pop. That's just bringing back, see, that's just bringing back that little bit of extra richness in the skin tones. Looks like I've got a good suntan there. Don't know how I managed that in lockdown, but there we go. I'm just going to bump that down a little as well. Yeah, that looks nice. Okay. Then for the lightness, let's open this up and put it here. This is like a luma curve. You know, it's a way of adjusting the lightness without affecting the saturation. And what I'm going to do here is just start pulling that across so that we bring up the highlights. And that's doing a nice job of that. But don't want to take away too much of the shadow. So I'm just going to nudge that in the middle so that the shadows stay relatively dark there. That's pretty good. I'm liking that. So what can we do next? I like it. It does feel a little bit too rich maybe at the moment. So I'm going to go in and use, let's see, we'll go for color balance here. Color balance is a great one. When an image is feeling a bit too warm or a bit too cool, this is I find this to be a more sophisticated way rather than just using white balance. Partly because you can affect the highlights, the midtones and the shadows separately, but also because you've got all 6 components of color to play with. It's not just temperature and tint. You've got cyan, red, magenta, green, and yellow and blue. So I'm going to try and just add a little more blue in the shadows, make those shadows feel just a little bit colder. And that way I can hopefully make the highlights feel a little bit warmer and create a bit more separation and contrast to really make this image pop. So I'm going to take the blue slider over somewhere. This is in the shadows, somewhere there. I like that, but let's just add a little bit of red in there as well, a tiny bit. Yeah, that looks good. That looks good. Let's go into our midtones. And essentially, you can see from the histogram up here, what I'm calling my midtones are actually really quite a long way down on the histogram. So they're very close to being shadows. I don't have a lot of information in the true midtones area. So I might as well treat these pretty much the same way as the shadows. So I'm just going to bump that across something similar to what we just did there. And then essentially with the highlights, we're just going to go the other way. So I'm going to take this more towards the cyan and this over towards the yellow. Let's see what that's giving me. Maybe a little click more. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, I'm liking this. Now, one thing that I find that's really important when you're dealing with color grading, you really need to reset your eyes, take a break from the screen, go and look at something that's, you know, completely different colors, because it's very easy. Your eye gets sort of accustomed very quickly to what you're looking at, and you won't see if you've, you know, overdone it on the reds, or you know, made the shadows too muddy or something. Another way of just refreshing your eyes and allowing you to see the image anew very quickly is just to flip the image. So I'm just going to do that there, and all of a sudden it looks kind of different. And what I'm noticing is the red in the skin on the temple and down the shadow that comes down the cheek. That's quite a big block of fairly uniform color there. I'm not so keen on that. That feels like it's dominating a bit. Let's go back to the right way round. Another thing to do, I'm just going to push the image over to this side and make it a little smaller. Another thing to do is vary the background color that you're working on. So currently we're working on a mid-gray. What happens to the image if we make the background completely black? Then what happens if we make the background completely white? So this is a good way of just resetting your eyes and making sure that what you're seeing is objective, let's say. So with grey is good. Let's bring that back in there. So as I said, I think I've got a bit too much going on with the reds here. One thing that I can do there, I know that this overlay layer that I put on initially is very often responsible for adding a bit too much red to the image. In fact, if I just switch it off now, you'll see we go back to this very much more sort of greenish grey overall. So I'm going to switch that back on, but maybe just drop the opacity something like 75. That feels a bit more like it. I want it to be rich, I want it to be very saturated, but there's a point beyond which it just looks a bit too much. And then in a similar vein, because it's just that red area here that's bothering me through the skin. I mean, it's there, it's present in the skin and the desk. So I'm just going to open a HSL layer and just deal with the reds by themselves. And there's three things that I can do with HSL, right? I can shift, I can change the saturation, and I can change the luminosity. And I like to do a little bit of all three so that the effect is subtle but gets me to where I need to be. So I'm just going to shift the reds ever so slightly towards green, minus 2.6, that's fine. I'm just going to take down the saturation of the reds a little bit. Yeah, minus 3, that's good. And I'm going to increase the luminosity. Now, when you increase luminosity of something, of course, you're also desaturating it because you're adding white, so there's less color. Maybe that's a bit too much. Let's just bump it back. Something around there. That's looking pretty good. Yeah, I like that. So we're nearly done. The next thing that's on my list when I'm getting ready to finalize a picture is to have a look at that histogram. I bring up a levels command, and there's a bit of space at the top and a bit of space at the bottom. So let's deal with the shadows first. I'm going to bring that in to almost touching the white there, and it's going to go really, really dark. Don't worry, we're going to deal with that in a second. And we're going to bring the top slider in so that it's nearly touching those highlights to get them as crisp as they possibly can be. I just want to move my midpoint because my shadows are now too heavy. The dark hair is being lost a bit into the background. So I'm going to slide that down a little bit, something I don't know, somewhere around there, so that the hair is in shadow on this side. I don't need to see the detail, but I do want to see that outline before the background starts disappearing into this vignette that we've got. And because I brought up the black point to there, it's actually really heavy in these corners. So I'm just going to lift my overall black point so that although those shadows are crushed, they're not going to go to complete black. So let's take a look at that. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. One thing that I like to do to finish images very often is just to add a layer of film grain. So I'm going to pop that on there now. And let's just get that lined up. There we go. And I'm going to switch that to overlay mode. And I'm going to save that. We don't need that final layer. And then I'm just going to, will that allow me to delete? There we go. I'm just going to switch back to what we started with, which was that, and then switch all the layers back on. Boom. And there we go. Easy. And because I love you so much, we've put a link in the description below so that you can go and download the lookup table and the 2 color overlays that I've used in this tutorial.